Hey, this is Suzi Marsh, Meffen, licensed clinical social worker. I want to talk to you today about spirituality, atheism, agnosticism, and religion. So if you have seen my video about my miraculous conversion from atheism, you know that my first night in a 12-step meeting, I was converted basically because I told my new sponsor the first night. She introduced herself to me as my sponsor, thank goodness, and told me to get on my knees. Thank God for keeping me clean that day. This was in a drug recovery 12-step program. And I said, I can't, I'm an atheist. And she said, fine, get on your knees, tell God you believe he doesn't exist, and if he does, let you know. So I thought, that's a great idea, that's really cool. So when I did, my cat jumped in my lap, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was unconditional love. Now, that was 42 and a half years ago, so my spirituality has matured and improved. But I want you to know that I noticed something as a therapist when I would talk to my clients, especially in recovery, if most of the treatment centers promote 12-step recovery because it promotes long-term recovery, and it's where I met my higher power. So I noticed something, that if I had a client who got either really angry or seemed really uncomfortable when I asked them about spirituality, not religion, I devised this little exercise. At the beginning of getting to know a client, if we were working on addiction especially, I would ask them, and I would write this list. I would say, list all of the negative characteristics of your mother. I would write them down. List all of the negative characteristics of your father. I'd write them down, and then I would list down also the positives. And then I would say, now tell me about your higher power. What do you believe in? And if they believed in something, the majority of my trauma survivors perceived the higher power very similar to the way they experienced the abuser in their life. So I even had one client here in Florida say, wow, my stepdad is my higher power, and his stepdad was abusive. So for me, it was really helpful. And I think that I thought God was judgmental, but being a drug addict, I was doing illegal things and things that were of poor moral character. So I had to have a reason to do that. So being atheist was an easy way to change that. So I think it's interesting. I'm reading this book. I interviewed him in Atlanta, How God Changes Your Brain. He is a neuroscientist. He calls himself a neurotheologist because he studies and did lots of research on people having had or hoping to have spiritual experiences. So he would study meditators, people who prayed, fundamentalist people, people who were agnostic or atheist, and some of them still had like a meditation practice. So what he discovered, and this is what I didn't realize that I was looking at, is with my abuse survivors, their perception of God was coming from a wounded, hurt, or abused anterior cingulate. So the anterior cingulate is deep inside the brain. It goes around the thalamus area, the cingulate cortex. Actually, yes, it goes around the cingulate cortex. So I'm looking at his book, How God Changes Your Brain. So what's interesting is that all of these different areas in the brain, cingulate cortex, septal area, hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, frontal lobe, thalamus, striatum, all have to do with perception and reality and your perception of reality. So the anterior cingulate, I looked this up on AI, if it is abused, if it is damaged by childhood abuse, it leads to changes in the functioning and the structure of the anterior cingulate. It increases emotional reactivity, which might be why somebody would get angry if I would talk to them about spirituality. It decreases emotional regulation, so they might not be able to control that anger or that irritability. It decreases cognitive processing and decision making. It decreases attention. I can tell you, as an ADHD person, I was thinking this actually maybe relate to me also. It also causes alexithymia, which I had, which I think a lot of ADHD people have. Alexithymia means not having words for feelings. So I love Sharon Wakescheider because she would always say sad, mad, glad, afraid, guilty, ashamed. So those are the basic feelings, although shame and guilt are kind of complicated feelings, a little bit more advanced. So she taught me the language of feelings, so I was able to understand the emotional abuse that I went through. So I talk about that in some of my other videos. But abuse, childhood abuse, leads to changes in the functioning and structure of the cingulate gyrus. Guess what? The anterior cingulate allows you to experience God as loving and compassionate. It decreases religious anxiety, guilt, and fear, and anger by suppressing activity in the amygdala. So no wonder if you are abused as a child, your perception, first of all, your anterior cingulate is harmed. Your perception is much, much more negative. So my mom was emotionally incestuous. That means she wanted me to carry emotions that were way out of my psychological development. They were her feelings about my dad. And really, then I carried those feelings until I got therapy. So experiencing God as loving and compassionate is not easy to do if you have been abused. And for me, being a drug addict, it also was a way for me to rationalize the things that I did. So he calls these different parts of the brain, for example, the occipital parietal circuit identifies God as an object. So little kids, and he did all this research on having little kids draw pictures of God, so they usually would draw faces. So the occipital parietal circuit identifies God as an object that exists in the world. So the parietal frontal circuit establishes a relationship between the two objects known as you and God. So behind me is myself. I think I'm 2 or 3, maybe 4 at the oldest in that picture. So a lot of the work that I did as an early therapist in my own therapy was inner child work. So I keep this picture. My brother, who was killed by a drunk driver, is there. He's 2 years older than me. He was. And then one of my sisters, that's Kelly, she was 2 years younger. So I keep that as a reminder if I give myself negative self-talk that that's who I'm talking to. So she was also very precocious. So I got yelled at a lot. On this other side, this is my right shoulder, is a picture that a schizophrenic did when I was doing my practicum. I can't remember if that's what we called it, when I was in graduate school getting my degree in social work. So he was a schizophrenic. The weird thing is my brother was a schizophrenic. So I got to experience, my brother was killed when he had his break. And so I really only got to know him after he had his break for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years at the most, when he became different. You become different once you become schizophrenic. Your brain changes and you're different. So the great thing about this, Gary was his name. He did this picture of Jesus, and you can't see it in this video, but his picture of Jesus has bright blue eyes, which is not exactly Jewish. But he said, Suzi, Jesus had very deep blue eyes. I loved him. And the gift to me was I got to be around these schizophrenics, and I was on drugs when my brother had his psychotic break. So I had this really horrible feeling when he died of not really knowing him at all. And so being with all these schizophrenics in the community mental health center was this great gift to me. These are the things that I believe are God incidences. Now, I didn't believe anything like that when I was an atheist, but the fact that I got to heal some of the aspects of my brother, the trauma of having a schizophrenic brother 2 years older than you, came about as I was working with the schizophrenics. I'm looking at the time. So now it's funny. Schizophrenics and bipolars many times have a great connection to God, but sometimes it's not a real one. Sometimes it is actually an even stronger one because of the development of their brain has changed. So the frontal lobe creates and integrates all your ideas about God, positive or negative, including the logic you use to evaluate your religious and spiritual beliefs. Don't let me get into clients that were religiously abused, either used religion to instill fear and terror and never being good enough or whatever. I was raised Catholic and my mom had that. I never had that. I just was too precocious to believe that kind of stuff. But my mom carried extensive guilt. So she tried to pass that on. She tried not to pass that on to us and instead created a kind of a freedom, which was a little bit, I think I was too young to experience that kind of freedom. It wasn't really age appropriate. I guess my voice agrees. So the thalamus gives emotional meaning to your concepts of God. The thalamus gives you a holistic sense of the world and appears to be the key organ that makes God feel objectively real. So one of the things my mom did when she was emotionally incestuous with me, as I said, she would talk really bad about my dad. My dad loved me. I was his first girl. But I carried her rage, hurt, and anger until I got into my own healing process. And my dad and I became very close. And I talked to him about every single thing. My mom was sitting right there. Every single thing she said about him. And he cried, and we cried, and my mom cried, and my dad apologized very genuinely and from his heart. My mom didn't. And that was kind of typical. My mom was bipolar type 2, which is the lesser form of mania and depression. For example, it's called hypomania. Hypo means not hyper. So instead of being manic with psychotic delusional features, they're just extremely excitable. They can go for 2 or 3 days without sleep and never feel tired. So they have this excess energy. They look like a narcissist sometimes because the hypomania experience makes you feel invincible. So it came across, I kind of healed in my own therapy as if I were raised by a narcissist because of that attitude in the hypomania. But I know now she wasn't a narcissist. She was just bipolar untreated. And she knew this too. She knew she was. So my perception was of someone taking advantage of me emotionally, not physically or sexually. Well, physically, in the fact that she made me listen to her when I was way too young to hear those things. So I used to love this little skit on Saturday Night Live. And when, I guess it was the 70s, when Gilda Radner and Lorraine Newman, maybe, Lorraine was a mother and Gilda was leaning against her mother, and she goes, "My mom, I love her. She taught me how to hate men." And that was what I carried. So I carried emotionally, incestuously, carried my mom's issues. So I actually kind of recovered as if I were sexually abused because that was how deep that wounding did to me. So I never thought of myself as a severe trauma survivor until I was reading this about the brain. So my experiences of my higher power were similar to my mom's. So the thalamus, again, gives emotional meaning to your concepts of God and gives you a holistic sense of the world that appears to be the key organ that makes God feel objectively real. So my abuse survivors never feel safe. Before I did a lot of the work around my father, who was very passive and didn't stand up to my mother and was really quiet, and so you never knew what he was thinking, so he was kind of scary. And before I did that work, I seemed to run into a lot of disgenuine, emotionally mean, or emotionally extremely passive men. And it's funny, that's what I thought men were like. When I did this work, now it took a while, when I did that work, I suddenly was surrounded with men who were great parents, loved their children, loved their wife, were very involved in their families. So it's funny how my worldview changed as I healed that anterior cingulate from my mom. Also, I did forgive her, by the way, albeit on her deathbed. So, but I did. So, the amygdala, when overly stimulated, creates the emotional impression of a frightening, authoritative, and punitive God. Now, my mom was authoritative and punitive when I asked her to stop talking to me about her problems. So I guess I did have that with my higher power. She was enraged, and so that's when I decided, I didn't know how I would do it, but I decided to destroy myself. So a couple of years later, I found drugs. I had this memory when I had about 39 years clean, and it was crystal clear that when I made that decision to punish my mom by punishing me, really, it was like a death wish. So, and I don't think it was any mistake that it all came full circle. So, the punitive God and suppresses the frontal lobe. So if you've ever noticed people that like to argue with people that are Christian, like to argue with non-Christians, or atheists wanting to argue philosophy about God, a lot of times they aren't logical. They can't think of it logically. I can totally understand and relate to that. So my mom got into feminism. Now, my mom had 5 children. She got into feminism sometime when we were all young. So we all 4 of us girls, through that experience, kind of became feminist also. I think that also made it easy for me to later have more than one abortion, which I'm pretty sure God has forgiven me for. But in my mind, my worldview was I was totally okay with doing that act. Now, I understand that sometimes it's necessary, but I also can tell you, for me, I did not want, selfishly, I did not want to go through the process of having a baby and giving it up. Now, that was very selfish. The other great thing about this book is he talks about how something I thought was just Christianity that says we're all sinners. Basically, he talks about the neural circuits in the brain actually make us pretty self-centered until you get more mature, and then those circuits also mature and you begin to have empathy, or the ability to have feelings for other people's pain. So, the amygdala, when overly stimulated, creates this punitive God, and it suppresses logic. The striatum in the brain inhibits activity in the amygdala, allowing you to feel safe in the presence of God, or of whatever object concept that you are contemplating. So it's really cool. It makes perfect sense that the abuser becomes the higher power. The childhood brain stays sort of stuck if there's been emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. The worse the abuse, the worse damage to the anterior cingulate, and the more the worldview. Like I said, I hated men and I saw all men as bad, and suddenly when I worked through that stuff, I saw all these wonderful men around me, men that I love. So the worldview and the perception of the higher power changes. So it's interesting to really dig deep and try to understand your experience of what a higher power is. Notice I'm not talking about religion. If I have a religion, it's emotional intimacy, animals, higher learning, and for me, the 12-step program, because that's how I met God. And that is still my personal experience when I told God I didn't believe he existed. And he came to me. By the way, when I met my husband, I was in a meeting, a 12-step meeting, and I was running the program. So I was looking down at the program, And I heard this guy talking, and I thought, this guy is so masculine, but so vulnerable. I immediately heard in my right ear, that's your husband. So 26 years later, I had to convince him, though, a little bit. So the worldview changes. That's why I think it's so important in 12-step programs that we have an experience of a higher power. Because as this book says, and I didn't really get into that, when you have a spiritual experience, however you have it, and for me, higher learning is definitely one of the ways I experience God. So it's different for different people. Some people like yoga. Yoga does nothing for me. I'm too ADHD. I just don't dig it. Now, I have done meditation up to 45 minutes a day for a couple of years. I'm not so good at that anymore. I do it occasionally. And that will change your worldview because it changes the structures in the brain. So the best book on meditation is by Herbert Benson. And basically, I'll just give you the skinny. You find one word or one statement that you relate to. I choose this statement, I will to will, the highest will, because if left to my will, I might use drugs or drink again. So I choose the highest will. The will, I will to will, the highest will. So again, I don't go to church. I do go to 12-step meetings regularly, and that is my religion because that's where I met God. And the 12 steps are all about having good, strong morals. The basics to our basic principles are HOW, how it works: honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. Willingness to explore a higher power, willingness to explore our character defects and our character assets, and have those negatives removed from us. Eventually, when you mature in a 12-step program, you get to the 11th step, and thank God I didn't have the 11th step early on. I asked God all the time for things, and I'm going to tell you, I usually got them. I really did. I was such a believer. But the 11th step says, sought through prayer and meditation. I can't remember it. I've only been doing it 42 years. Really to do God's will, not mine. So even when my sponsor had me do my ideal mate list, I had to write on the top of it, your will, not mine, be done. Thank goodness I did that, because then I heard in my right ear, that's your husband. So we pray not only for knowledge of his will and the power to carry it out. That's the 11th step. So I no longer ask for things. If I do, I say first, if it is your will, not mine. So anyway, that's my take on spirituality. We are hardwired to have a higher power. Doesn't matter what it is. It does matter that it's not you. Thanks.